You know how much I love storytelling. It is one of the top tools that we want to have in our business. And it's not like when we talk about storytelling, a lot of people think about, public speakers that are doing like speeches in front of thousands of people. Storytelling is actually an everyday skill that we use in conversations that we have with our clients, potential clients, centers of influence. So this week, I invited a master storyteller to talk to us about the art and the science of storytelling. Let's go to the interview. So thank you, Diana. So today we have with us Diana Yazidjian, who is a storyteller out of this world. So before we start our interview and really dig deep in the topic today, Diana, could you take a moment and introduce yourself, please?
Of course. Thank you, Sara. Thank you for having me. Enjoyed talking to you. I'm Diana Yazidjian, founder of DFY Consulting. I founded my company 10 years ago after 10 years in Europe, exploring different projects, working for Orange Labs. And it's actually there that I first explored the technique of storytelling. Very randomly, it happened with circumstances. I was asked to deploy new norms. I was asked to launch new products. And intuitively came the idea of creating stories to convince people to come on board. And I also did a lot more than just storytelling, obviously. I did quality assurance, digital transformation projects, social media, helped startups find their purpose. Basically, mouton à cinq pattes, we say in French, a jack of all trades.
Definitely.
And that's how I like it. Diversity is the key to my motivation personally. So the more things I can touch, that I find I can do, yeah, the better I am, and people benefit from that because I get very enthused with new projects. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. So I'm fascinated by storytelling. I think it's a skill that every entrepreneur should develop. Now, what are the biggest challenges that you see when you want to help somebody, or that you see around storytelling that professional entrepreneurs do?
Well, first, everyone loves a good story. So because we're raised with stories, we tend to think that we can tell stories easily. And yes and no. We can tell stories of what happened to us in a day-to-day, but when it comes to telling stories for a very important goal, like we want to implement a new norm, or we want to launch a very innovative product, that requires a more, how could I say, a more solid approach.
An intentional approach.
Yes, and it requires to be aware of other variables, such as context. I always emphasize the word context. What does that mean? Before actually, planning a story, you need to know where our persona, which is basically our client, is the center of our story. What's the context of our persona? Let's be obsessed with our persona. We want to know everything about him or her in order to better understand. And when we better understand, we are better able to tell the story of that persona. Make sense?
Totally. So what are the mistakes that you see people
bypassing that step? thinking we know our persona so well because we've been selling to them for years. Yet, do you know what their pain points are really? Do they have kids? What are their challenges on their day-to-day? Are they happy with their lives? Do they have many activities? That kind of context, that kind of awareness, which is unusual because we were brought up in socio-demographic way of thinking. Between 25 and 35, revenue this much, 2 kids, went to university,
demographic segment,
sits on a board. But that's very mathematical. Mm-hmm. That is not lifestyle. That is not emotional attributes of your persona, which leads us to the core of the story needs to create a connection and an emotional connection. How can you create an emotional connection to your customers if you don't know the emotional variables of your customers?
It's true, because a lot of people think about, when I talk with advisors or with entrepreneurs and I'm like, oh, who's your client? They're like, well, they tell me about the gender, they tell me about their profession, they tell me about their age, their revenue. And I'm like, okay, let's talk about psychographic.
Exactly.
That is the key to getting a good story. It's to understanding that.
Totally. And it also why it makes us uncomfortable is because I'll tell you why. You feel like you're snooping, you're prying, you're going into the personal chapter of a persona. And that is unusual. And that is a little disruptive. I spent 5 weeks with a health group back in December, and we tackled that. And it made everyone a little, jittery. But at the end, people understood where we're going with this. And they started even inventing the life of the persona. But that was good. They used their imagination. They said, okay, that persona, and probably was self-reflective, when they added attributes of the CEO of the company, because that was their client, right? Well, the CEO of the company has a second wife and step kids, and one of them is elite hockey. The other one is upset because he doesn't get all the attention. It started becoming that detail. But you know what? When it came time to create the story, they framed it totally differently.
Yes, because you understand the real needs.
Real needs.
Superficial needs, you understand the real needs.
And why we do this is also because it has an impact on what goes on in the brain. When you get the story, when you receive the story, when you're on the receiving end, and you receive that story with the persona analyzed the way we just did it with psychographics and lifestyle, the story feels different. And your brain captures it differently in a more emotional way. You see?
Yes, definitely. And if we could just sidetrack for a second.
Sure.
And because I'm putting myself in the shoes of an entrepreneur who's watching us right now, and maybe some of them are asking, why should I start using stories as a business tool? What would you say?
Well, in order to trigger change or trigger an action, which is in this case, get new customers, I firmly believe that you cannot just list the features of your services and hope that it will work. Even the most rational of us has an emotional part of their brain that is thirsty for an emotional connection, whether he or she admits it or not.
We, as a professional, I can use stories to convert a client.
Absolutely.
And to an existing client.
And what is the challenging part of the story is to not fall in the trap of telling the story of the product, but telling the story of the client using the product.
Because I can, as a potential client, I could see myself
projection
using that product, using the solution.
Absolutely.
Going through that process.
Exactly. That's what happens in your brain. If I can just share a slide on the impact of a story on our brains.
Awesome. Yes, definitely.
This is our brain on storytelling. Whenever we hear a story that we feel concerned, that we feel they're talking about us. Yes. This is called mirroring. Our brain is saying, oh, I've seen this already. This situation, I've experienced it. That is the start of the hook. It's the start of capturing the person's attention. And neurologists say that when you have that mirroring effect, you're increasing your chances that your customer listening to the story will memorize the story will remember the story 1 week from now. And that is very good for any company to have the story being remembered, right?
Exactly. We all want to be memorable.
And then there's also, like I remember you saying, Sara, in another video that we have, us humans, we're more advanced than mammals. So we have the analytical part, right? That analyzes the story, and that takes different parts of the story and says, oh, this is something I can understand. It makes sense to me. So again, it's soliciting the cortex activity. Finally, there's the dopamine part. When a story has a very good ending, whereas the solution solves the client's problem, for example, it has a good ending, and the good ending really talks to the customer. It releases dopamine. And dopamine is a very positive hormone. We love the feeling of dopamine. And when you could actually achieve that in your story, you're again increasing your chances of memorization of your story, hence action.
So it's like me going to a movie and it has an amazing ending. I will be talking about that movie because I remember the story.
The emotion that you got from that story.
Yeah.
And you want to recreate it. You want to refeel it all the time. So, I mean, we do that in business. The business, it's not only in the movies, it actually happens in business. And those that really understood that are the ones that are achieving their goals.
Love it. Love it. Tell me, we pivot now and say, okay, I understand why I need a story in my business, why I need to develop the art and the science of storytelling. Some of the pitfalls that people fall into, which is, assuming is a huge one, not going deeper also in my ideal client, their pain point, their dreams. What are actionable tips that you could share to get people really into moving into storytelling?
Okay. Well, the first part is understanding that the client needs to be center stage of your story. Mm-hmm. It's all about your client. It's not about you. It's not about the product. So your product by default needs to solve your client's problem. Mm-hmm. So let's just get that out of the way. If your product does not solve the client's problem, you need to go back. If it's a nice to have and that he's already very content with his or her solution, you need to go back in the drawing board and say how we could better differentiate that. I say this because I've had clients already coming to me with, we want a story, and then realizing that I can't build miracles right now with a product that doesn't solve a real life problem. Mm-hmm. Once we have that and we know that there's a problem to be fixed, then we have to be obsessed with the reality of our customer. What are the tensions? I like the tensions that they experience every day, the pain points that are building up to a point that you think your product will be the solution to them. Why is it important to identify those pain points and not miss one? Mm-hmm. Because by doing that, you're telling your customer, I understand you. I care. I know where you're coming from. And the customer, when he or she realizes that you have understood their reality, that's part of the selling right there.
Yes. Because
does that make sense?
You get me.
It's called empathy.
Yes. And if you get me and I feel the empathy, you'll be able to help me solve that problem that I have.
Exactly. And I get this question a lot from clients, but how many stories do we build? I mean, we don't all have, our clients don't all have the same pain points or the same context. And that's a great question. And I always jokingly tell my clients, well, you have to be schizophrenic.
Schizophrenic.
You got to have different personalities. Jokingly, I say this, but what I mean is not one size fits all. Yeah. So if you have, for example, two main categories of clients, two main that bring in most of the revenue, or that you think will generate most of the revenue. Focus your attention on these two categories and make your stories just for them. Don't try to make variants of stories for those little customers that will only bring 5% of revenue.
Yes.
That's too much effort. It's not efficient of an approach. So
it's not a good return on energy.
There you go. I love it. ROE. I love it, Sara.
It's not a good return.
It's not a good return on energy. And on cost.
Yes, definitely. Before we wrap up, is there a question that you think that I didn't ask you, or that I should have asked you, regarding the art and the science of storytelling?
Yes, actually.
Okay.
And you just gave it to me on a silver platter. How is story part art, part science?
Yes.
And most of the time I don't get that question because people don't know that it's part art, part science. And let me explain why. I just gave you a nice little scheme of the brain and all the triggers that comes with a good story. Well, that's the scientific part that we overlook too often, unfortunately. And we must spend at least 50-60% of our working time addressing what the impact is on our brains from a scientific approach, from a neurological approach. And then the art part, which is the coding of the story. What colors are we going to use? If it's the visual channel we choose to send our story. What kind of words are we going to use? What connotation do they have? This is all the artistic part. What kind of personas do we use? What's their appearance? What is the flow of our story? Is it going to be a two-part story, or just one short and sweet summarized version of it? All that is more of the artistic chapter. So it's a mix of both. It's definitely a mix of both to really nail it, to really nail your story.
Definitely. And if I could add, it's also practice.
Practice as in talking, as in telling your story?
Like practice sharing stories. It's not something that we rationalize. Yes, there's a framework that we want to follow, but then it's also, you need to practice storytelling so it becomes a natural art and a natural skill.
That's a very good point. And I think we all have someone in our lives that told good stories.
Oh, yeah.
And that we were, it's like, and then we should remember that storyteller in our lives and why they made it so good. What was it that made the story captivating? And try to recreate it in your minds.
Yeah. And often it's like an uncle, an aunt, or, grandfather, parent, whatever.
There
and
you go.
Always shared stories. So
absolutely.
Continuously practiced it.
Exactly.
Diana, thank you so much. Before we wrap up, so I play a little game when we do interviews.
I love games.
They're surprise questions. So they are questions. I will pick 3 questions. They're surprise questions, and they're really questions designed to learn more about the human behind the expert. So you shared a lot of insight on, the pitfalls that we do in storytelling, like how do we want to structure a story, the importance of sharing a story. So variable insight. Now let's learn a little bit more about the human behind, so who you are. So I'll pick a question and short answer, a word, a sentence, whatever. So it helps us understand and learn more about you. Are we good?
Okay, I'll do my best. Oh, this is fun.
So our first question today is, what are you the most grateful for in life?
That's an easy one. But there are actually different series of answers, but let me just start with one. And it's actually something that is a little taboo, but I'll just say it as a provocative way.
Love it.
I'm very grateful for my hypersensitivity. And I know that it's a black and white type of discussion. Some people, dismiss it, others value it, but I wouldn't have been able to do storytelling the way I do it now if it wasn't for my hypersensitivity, which makes me always put myself in the other person's shoes. How can they feel if they hear this, if they hear that, if they observe this, if they observe. I'm constantly doing that in everything I do. And I think that's due to my hypersensitivity.
And it's a beautiful personality trait.
Oh, thank you, Sara.
Definitely a beautiful. Second question, what would you do if you had more courage?
10
times more courage. What would you do?
It would definitely be, from a professional, personal.
Whichever way you want to go.
Courage has always been on my to-do list, in that I'm always trying to tackle something that I'm frightened of. Always. I don't know where that comes from, if it's in my genes or whatever, but actually, when I was at Spark the Change in 2017 or 2018, I took storytelling, but as part of a way to alleviate fear. So you need to tell a story in order to tackle your fears. I totally pivoted for that specific conference, and people were like, "Yeah, you're right. We're blinded by our values. We're blinded by our ways, by our education. Sometimes it's actually a break to going further." And
one thing you would do if you had 10 times more courage?
So I would definitely, and you know what? 10 years ago, I wouldn't have answered this, but it would be to do parachute.
Oh, I'm actually going this summer. It's on the bucket list. We're addressing the bucket.
I was supposed to do that 15 years ago, and the winds were bad. And at that time, that wasn't even an issue. Now I'm thinking about it twice. So
nice. I'll let you know after we go.
Okay, you do that.
Good. Third question.
Yeah.
What's your top priority in your life right now?
My top priority in my life right now is to always make sure, and that's a constant, my children are happy, are stable, and professionally would continue to preach the power of story. I'm just starting. I always feel that it needs to be put out there increasingly. And that's my priority right now. And I'm actually, being my own coach, because I want to make sure that I optimize every channel to spread the word on the power of story.
Definitely. It's something that I profoundly believe in. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Sara.
Where can people find you online?
They could definitely find me on all channels through DFY Digital, underscore or not underscores.
Okay, we'll put the links, all the links.
Wonderful. So and Diana Yazidjian on LinkedIn, hook me up. I'll be happy to have a conversation with you. And YouTube. So everywhere else, yeah.
So whenever we want to learn more about storytelling and developing that art, we'll put all the links in.
I have many blog posts on the topic on LinkedIn Pulse and on my website, dfyconsulting.com, if they want to have a first look at the approach before actually get in the model with me.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. It was lovely talking to you.
I hope you liked this episode. If you did, first of all, please give it a thumbs up. Make sure you connect with Diana. She has so many insights and really like a framework to help us build stories so we can be more impactful in our communications. So now, once we understand how that stories is such a way that the brain functions, it's such a tool that we need in our toolbox, and we start using it in our conversations, we see that so much more is possible. If you like this episode, like I said, give it a thumbs up. But if you'd like to receive it in your inbox, along with exclusive resources to build and run your service-based business, head on over to our website and subscribe to our blog, which is also known as the Best Blog. We talk about marketing, productivity, and mindset. Basically, all the tools you need to achieve. Thank you for being here week after week, and I will see you next Tuesday.